You can kill the prophet, but you can't kill the god. Your chance to warn the earth has come and gone. We are coming, we are hungry, we are here. The hunger and reference belonging to the topic of today's video, the sinister Brethren Moons of Dead Space. As to what they are, the Brethren Moons, sometimes referred to as Brother Moons, Blood Moons, or Necromoons, are gigantic, highly intelligent spacefaring necromorphs that stand out as the source of the marker signal, the Brethren Moons being the direct result of a convergence event, and are believed to be the final life stage of the necromorph life cycle. Role-wise within the Dead Space storyline, they are the central antagonists, their goals being the eventual killing and total consumption of any and all life in the universe. Now giving an overview of the Brethren Moons, they are colossal, far larger than any other form of necromorph previously encountered in the franchise. So big they use an entire hollowed out planet as a shell to maintain a coherent shape, likely composed from billions of different species that have undergone death and convergence events, the surface of each moon acting as a protective casing and/or shell, similar to the shells worn by certain mollusks, but personally I think their body structure more resembles that of a nautilus, a species of deep-sea cephalopod. Regardless, Brethren Moons can withdraw themselves into their shells when not feeding, making them appear to be little more than a rogue planet, simply drifting through the vacuum of space. Within the protective shell, the body of the creature rests, composed of numerous long tentacles that can reach out thousands of miles in length, and are capable of reaching a planet's surface from orbit without the moon itself being pulled into the planet's gravity. Situated within its massive tentacles is a vast circular maw that appears to function as the creature's head, the head possessing 5 colossal yellow eyes resembling those seen on the Nexus organisms such as the hive mind or the Ubermorph, the sheer size of the mouth and head allowing it to ingest large amounts of biological material very fast. Another similarity the Brethren Moons share with the hive mind is the various branched appendages protruding from behind the creature's large head, and hanging at the entrance point of the creature's mouth is an irregular mass of tissue made up of multiple eyes, tentacles, a fang-lined slit and a circular sucking mouth. This small head primarily existing to break down raw materials and destroy any living thing that manages to survive up to that point. But overall, morphology-wise, the Brethren Moons are, simply put, best described as being gigantic cephalopod-like organisms with a hard exterior shell and a very specialist mouth for maximum consumption. Now, in regards to the behaviour of the Brethren Moons, as stated by the Brethren Moons themselves, the Earth draws near. Even now we can feel it, teeming with life, teeming with markers. From each world we devour, a new brother will rise and be made whole. Our network will grow and we will live forever. This is the Brethren Moons very clearly stating their intention. Their goal is to consume worlds, to feed themselves, and to produce more of their kind. But in addition to this, research notes from Dr. Earl Serrano speculate that the moons are drawn to species that grow and spread throughout the galaxy in particular, preferring to target advanced civilizations due to the organic compulsion to grow and expand until a point is reached where the resource for a given race can no longer keep up with the growth of its population. He speculated that this was how they discovered the alien race of Tall Volantis, who were once an empire trillions strong. However, the Tall Volantis species created the large alien machine that was previously mistaken for a city, and froze their own planet, which killed their own species but stopped the formation of another Brethren Moon in the process. Interestingly enough, Serrano's theory is backed up by the limitless energy the markers radiate, by encouraging any species with a desperate need for resources and energy to focus on building more markers across their systems as to harness energy from them. This makes the species less able to enact quarantines effectively, further enabling the madness and necromorph outbreaks the markers bring. And in addition to their faster-than-light movement capabilities, the moons are sentient organisms and are capable of communicating via telepathic signals across incredible distance, along with the ability to cause hallucinations by using their telepathic abilities to influence the minds of lesser creatures. During the hallucinations where they spoke to Isaac and Carver through their prophet, the cult leader, who for context is a boss you encounter in Dead Space 3 Awakened, the moons display a hive mind mentality by referring to themselves in the plural sense, implying that each moon views itself simply as an extension of a greater whole. The moons are also extremely egotistical, regarding themselves as invincible, omnipotent, and divine, often referring to themselves collectively as a god. But in spite of this, they prefer to speak calmly and politely when dealing with Isaac, which is an incredibly strong contrast to their actual nature. Additionally, these creatures lack any form of empathy or remorse whatsoever, as they don't appear to be saddened or angered by the destruction of their own kind nor by the defeat of their prophet, possibly because due to how ancient these creatures are, they believe everything around them to simply be disposable or replaceable, or simply just cattle to be slaughtered and harvested. But outside of how the Brethren Moons behave directly, we can see from some of the necromorphs throughout the Dead Space franchise who are still definitely alive and sentient, like the Weezer, Wall Guardian, Exploder, and a few other sub-variants. It appears that the Brethren Moons have gone out of their way to deliberately leave the sentience of these necromorphs or some semblance of their original humanity intact as to torch them for possibly resisting the influence of these creatures, which is further backed up by the existence of the Lurker and the Crawler, both of which are infected infants, and exist both to kill people and cause as much psychological damage to people as possible, as by weakening someone's psychological state it makes them more susceptible to the marker's influence. The pack necromorphs, which consist of reanimated younglings, also further proving this point. It is very clear from this that absolutely nothing is sacred to the Brethren Moons and there is no lines they won't cross. And with that, that is the behaviour of the Brethren Moons. Now to cover the history of these creatures. Starting with how long these creatures have existed, no one is entirely sure, albeit they have most certainly existed for an incredibly long time before humanity, spreading throughout the stars, littering planets with markers, driving species to grow and then consuming them. This going on until markers land on Earth. Interestingly enough, in the case of Earth, the black marker was carried inside of an asteroid striking the Yucatan Peninsula around 65 million years ago, wiping out the dinosaurs and creating a path for mammals to become the new dominant life form. It's believed by the unitologists and individuals affected by marker-dementia, which for context is characterized by a serious loss of cognitive ability in previously unimpaired individuals. Within the context of Dead Space, the term is used to describe the psychological effects of the marker specifically. Symptoms can include acute depression, insomnia, personality shifts, vivid hallucinations, obsessive or violent behavior, extreme paranoia, and other schizophrenic-like symptoms. A primary example of this would be when Isaac Clarke sees a vision of his dead girlfriend and a red marker as a result of his dementia. Anyway, those affected by this condition, and the unitologists, believe that the markers themselves are responsible for encouraging the evolution of a sentient species through the broadcasting of an altered version of their signal, evident from notes found on the walls of the Ishimura medical deck, with the ultimate goal of creating a species intelligent enough to study the black marker, understand how to replicate it, and build the red markers. After a host world has been reached, the black markers fall dormant for a period of time, awakening only once the dominant lifeform of the planet has achieved a certain level of technological development. Once this threshold is reached, it starts to put out the signal, leading to marker-dementia, which manifests as homicidal or suicidal tendencies in those of a more simple mindset. But if someone is more intelligent, they'll start to see codes and instructions and an overriding compulsion to replicate the marker. The signal of the markers at first is a seemingly limitless source of electromagnetic energy which drives intelligent species to create red markers, copies that are inevitably distributed throughout their territory. However, the signal has a second function that remains dormant for a period of time after discovery, being able to alter the necrotic tissue of dead organisms at the molecular level, causing corpses to reanimate and become necromorphs, hostile biorecombinant creatures that spread like a pandemic, which becomes nearly impossible to contain due to the widespread markers. After necromorph infestation has claimed a sufficient level of biomass around the marker may initiate a convergence event, the birth of a new Brethren Moon. And while this event can be triggered by a black marker or the red copies, the latter requires the maker of the marker to be killed and absorbed in order to fulfill convergence. Once the convergent event begins, all necromorphs and any other dead tissue within the marker's area of influence are flung into the stratosphere, where they begin to form into the biological core of a new moon, which later absorbs fragments of its host world to form a protective shell around its body. We currently do not know what happens to the moon once it absorbs all the life from the world it came from, but it's believed and theorized that the newborn moon will travel to the nearest source of organic life to continue feeding, conserving energy in a torpor hibernation state, while at the same time being alert for any signs of potential prey. Dr. Earl Serrano speculated that all life between the origin of the Brethren Moons and humanity's home system has been extinguished by them, mixing the genetic material of countless species across the universe into their uniform biomass, which fascinatingly proposes an answer to the Fermi paradox. For context on what the Fermi paradox is the discrepancy between the lack of conclusive evidence of advanced extraterrestrial life and the apparent likelihood of its existence. To simplify what that means, it's the discrepancy between why are we not finding aliens despite it being very likely that they should exist. This whole thing personally reminded me of the Great Filter, which for context is the idea that, in the development of life from the earliest stages of, abiogenesis to reaching the highest levels of development on the Kardashev scale, there is a barrier to development that makes detectable extraterrestrial life exceedingly rare, this being one possible resolution to the Fermi paradox. I bring this up because it is possible that the Brethren moons could be a form of this great filter, albeit that's at least my interpretation. Also, for further context on the Kardashev scale, to make this super simple, it's basically a Type 1 to Type 3 civilization system. Type 1 is able to access all energy available on its planet and store it for consumption. Type 2 civilizations can directly consume a star's energy, most likely through the use of Dyson spheres. A Dyson sphere basically being a bunch of solar panels flying around a sun to harness as much energy from it as possible. And Type 3 is a civilization able to capture all energy emitted by its galaxy, and every object within it, such as every star, black hole, etc. Under this scale, the sum of human civilization does not reach Type 1 status, that being as of the 11th of March 2025, although it does continue to approach it. And there are various extensions of the scale that have been proposed, albeit we're not going to touch that because they're irrelevant to the video. Anyway, enough with the context, now to get back to the actual Brethren moons. As I was saying, humanity never had the opportunity to contact aliens, not because they simply didn't exist, but because a massive super predator had simply consumed most if not all of them, leaving much of it in a state of dead space. Badumts. Hence the title of the game franchise. Anywho, Serrano also discovered that the moons are linked to one another through a telepathic network spanning the universe, which they use to communicate as the markers influence effects other sentient species, leading to the creation of more markers and thus continue to expand the network. An example again of this process being the Tor Volantis moon. Regarding the history of said moon, millennia ago on Tor Volantis, convergence and the creation of a new Brethren moon were interrupted by the alien species inhabiting the planet, which was carried out through the giant machine. Said machine flash freezing the entire planet, halting the event in its tracks entirely. Albeit in response to this, the moon began using markers across the galaxy to broadcast a distress signal to any and all who could comprehend it, such as make us whole and turn it off, hoping to lure new organic beings to Tor Volantis so they could disable the mechanism, allowing it to complete the convergence event and continue the cycle of extinction and endless consumption. And with all that, we can now move on to the events of the first Dead Space game, but we're going to be using Dead Space Remake instead. Primarily because 1, it tells the same story, and 2, we actually get a bit more information out of it. Getting straight into that, during the incident on Aegis 7 in 2508, Marker 3A was able to give one of the miners, Brant Harris, knowledge of the Brethren moons, which he later attempted to explain to Chalice Mercer. When questioned about the marker's secrets, Harris claimed that the voices from the marker, which he called God, were hungry to be heard, like stars are hungry. Marker 3A was also able to communicate with Isaac Clarke, with one of its hallucinations pleading with the engineers to turn it off, referring to the alien machine keeping the Tor Volantis moon frozen. So the marker's whispers also told Isaac that he needed to hear their voices and that the Brethren were cold and would soon wake. They're hungry, they're coming, they'll make us whole. Brant Harris. And with that, we can now move on to the events of Dead Space 2. The Site-12 marker on Titan Station attempted to create a Brethren moon by initiating a convergence event, after much of the station's population had been slaughtered and converted into necromorphs. However, this process was halted by Isaac Clarke, the creator of the marker, who seemingly defeated the intelligence guiding the marker by battling it with his own mind, and destroying the artifact along with it, which implies the creator of a marker can combat the moons by actively resisting their influence at least to some extent. During the actual fight against the creature's influence, we see the mouth of a moon, which is seen behind the Site-12 marker's heart as Isaac battles it. Albeit while fighting his way through Project Telomere's lab on his way to the marker, Isaac discovers logs from one of the scientists, Kinner Phelps, detailing his growing suspicion that humans were merely puppets of some alien influence, and claims that the rationalizations for creating marker copies were nothing but illusions planted by a force behind the original marker maker, the Black One. A notable quote from the markers during this game being, "You can't stop what's coming," which is broadcasted directly through the marker signal directly to Isaac's brain. Next we have the events of Dead Space 3, my least favourite in the franchise. During the events on Tor Volantis, Isaac Clarke learns that the source of the signals being emanated by the markers was the incomplete moon orbiting the planet, and if the moon was freed, any location within humanity's territory with active markers would instantly become targeted for assimilation. Should the moon complete convergence, it would make the moons aware of every major source of human life in the galaxy, And Isaac and Carver also learned about the alien machine being in fact designed to destroy the Tall Volantis moon by crashing it into the planet itself, albeit this was never properly configured due to the extinction of the species that created it. Albeit the moon was then set free by the Unitologist leader Jacob Danik. And for context on who Jacob Danik is, he's a high-ranking member of the Church of Unitology, and the leader of the militant Unitologist organization known as the Circle, who are antagonists in Dead Space 3. Anyway, Isaac and Carver raced to the machine to stop the moon for good, managing to reconfigure the machine and kill the Tall Volantis moon. Albeit their victory was short-lived, as while the moon was incomplete, it managed to absorb enough biomass to contact the rest of its brethren. The Brethren moon also clearly had an effect on the SCAF scientists who were on the Tall Volantis moon as well, evident from the following quote. "Now I know how the holy man must feel when he is called by God. The intense rush of infinity, the pure exhilaration of it is almost too much. It's like a chorus of thousands, my friends, shipmates, everyone who is being called up to God speaks to me now. They want to know everything, they need to know everything. What secrets will they share? I go now, a vessel waiting to be filled. Share with me the secrets of the universe." This very clearly being a SCAF scientist affected by the influence of the incomplete moon, evident from a lot of the religious themes. But anyway, next up we have the events of Dead Space 3 Awakened, which I'll personally say I absolutely dislike this DLC, for reasons I'll cover later. Anyway, following the destruction of the Tall Volantis moon and their subsequent fall into the planet below, Isaac and Carver reawaken in a frozen crevice. They make their way towards the surface, and notice the fallen moon out on the horizon. Isaac believing that after the moon's destruction the signal should cease entirely, and there should not be any more necromorphs. However, he soon suffered from a brief vision from the other moons and realized the necromorphs were still active. The remaining Unitologist soldiers in Tall Volantis then started to lose faith when the moon was destroyed, believing there would be no convergence or rebirth, only death. However, they then heard a voice from the awakened Brethren moons, saying, "We are coming, make ready the way." Surviving Unitologists' faith was quickly rekindled, some choosing to kill themselves immediately in order to meet the voice, while most left the planet to make ready the way as the voice commanded. With his faith in Unitology reaffirmed, a particular fanatic claiming to speak for the voice began to gather the remaining Circle members into orbit, inducting them into his new cult of mutilation and sacrifice to honor the moons. Only a few of them resisted, either mentally broken by the moon's signal or repeatedly chanting the mantra, "They are hungry, they are coming," or outright attempting to resist and escape from their insane former brethren, who had been consumed by the moon's desires. Isaac and Carver ultimately reached the CMS Terra Nova and were subject to painful visions of the moons, Isaac suspecting they're being manipulated and taking the ship back to Earth so the moons could follow them, at which point he decides to destroy the stock point drive and trap them at Tall Volantis forever. Carver, who's determined to recover the drive and return to Earth to warn the rest of humanity, instead threatened Isaac upon seeing his growing paranoia. The pair fought the cult leader after a tense hallucinatory confrontation and discovered upon his defeat the moons already knew where Earth was the whole time. It simply turned Isaac and Carver against one another to prevent them from warning Earth in time. So knowing they have little time to act, Isaac and Carver installed the salvage stock point device on the Terra Nova, overloaded the ancient reactor of the ship to power it up by shocking out just before the ship broke down entirely. Then arriving at Earth, Isaac and Carver tried to contact the authorities through several channels to relay a warning, albeit each response met with static. After several tries, a transmission breaks through, the gurgles and snarls of many necromorphs, and then the duo are shocked when they see that the Brethren moons are rising from the other side of the Earth as they scoured the surface of the planet with their tentacles. Another moon then suddenly appearing in front of the Terra Nova, seemingly crashing into it, leaving their fate unclear. Which brings us to the end of the Dead Space timeline. Which, interesting enough, there was actually supposed to be a Dead Space 4. But from the few sources we have on it, it would have been a microtransaction riddled mess, and frankly, it's better off we just interpret that they both died. But anyway, with that is the entire Dead Space history and timeline of the Brethren moons covered. I would talk about the trivia next, but first I want to give my thoughts on the aforementioned Awakened DLC and why I disliked it so much. The first thing I'll say is bringing back Isaac and Carver when they were willing to sacrifice themselves to save everyone else completely undermines that writing choice, especially when we see the Brethren moons find Earth anyway. Secondly, the cult leader boss fight. I absolutely hated that fight. It was just the most unfun shit. And overall, I just didn't like the Awakened DLC, gameplay and story-wise, it just wasn't very good. I just feel like Isaac Clarke and Carver sacrificing themselves to stop the Brethren moons finding Earth would be a more fitting ending. But anyway, that's all I really have to say on the DLC. Now to talk about the trivia. First being, as in most of the previous games, the first letter of each chapter of Dead Space 3 spells a phrase. This such phrase in Dead Space 3 is Brother Moons are awake, foreshadowing the events of Awakened. The first letters of the Awakened DLC's chapters form RIP, an acronym for Rest in Peace, which may indicate humanity did not survive the Moons. Next up, the Moons are a clear reference to Lovecraftian horror and the works of H.P. Lovecraft, a monstrous, intelligent, devouring godlike entity that seemingly can't be stopped by anything. Even the art of Dead Space confirms this influence, stating that the Moons were designed to feel as if they'd stepped out of the Lovecraftian mythos, calling to mind the Great Old Ones as reference. They especially show a similarity to Yog-Sothoth, an outer god from the Cthulhu mythos, appearing as 7 glowing spears and a mass of writhing tentacles. The Moon's appearance was also partly inspired by a squid, and by a jellyfish, and was intended to resemble the feverish imaginings of a 18th century sailor, recalling the fantastical interpretations of sea life from that historical period. According to a 2021 interview with franchise producer and co-writer Chuck Beaver, the Brethren Moons were established as official lore between Dead Space 1 and 2. While developing Dead Space 2 and in preparation for the potential 3rd and 4th games, Chuck Beaver wrote a lore bible with necromorph designer Ben Wanat, which included the end goal of the markers and necromorphs. Hints at the Moon's network were featured prominently in Dead Space 2, mainly in the architecture and artwork found throughout the Church of Unitology on Titan Station. In addition to this, the formation of a necromoon was heavily hinted at during the convergence with the Site-12 marker, as the bodies of the necromorphs could be seen being flung into the air above the marker to become one body. Same goes on during the final fight against Nicole, where a mouth resembling that of a moon or hive mind could be seen behind the heart of the marker. Also, according to Chuck Beaver, the original story him and Ben planned for Dead Space 3 would feature Isaac Clarke alongside a dark version of himself which empathized his dementia. It would have eventually culminated in Isaac leading the Brethren Moons to Earth due to being a herald of the markers, for having DNA that was compatible with the marker signal as described by Beaver. Isaac was what the necromorph ecology looks like in its prey species. Somebody to help them eat the rest of the inhabited planets, he said. Elements of this original concept were repurposed for the Awakened DLC, with the Moons specifically asking Isaac to lead them to Earth while John Carver did not experience such visions. In fact, according to Beaver, the story of Awakened was much closer to what Dead Space 3 was envisioned to be at the time of Dead Space 2 than the game's base. And with that, that's the last piece of trivia. But that's not the last thing I want to say. I want to say firstly, I preferred Dead Space 1 and 2 over 3. 3 was not my favourite. And 2, I've been somewhat quiet and whispering throughout this video because I started recording this at 3 in the morning, it is now 8:30 AM, and I didn't want to wake people up. But yeah, and with that, before you go, if you enjoyed this video, do give it a like, a comment. If you have any valid criticism, just do pop that down in the description. Also, if you are a fan of my videos, there should be a link in the description to my Discord where you can get notified when new videos come out because, unfortunately, the YouTube notification system these days is poopy garbage. It can take up to a week for a subscriber notification to go through, so yeah, that's a better way of doing it. But yeah, with that, that's all I have to say on the Brethren Moons for this video. I hope you enjoyed, see you around, goodbye.